Welcome to Tequi Vida with Dr. J, where life and technology intersect. Welcome back to Tequi Vida. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Acuña, who will be sharing her insights within higher education and the ever-pressing issue of the digital divide. Dr. Acuña is a scholar within the educational field, more particularly within higher ed. Dr. Acuña holds a PhD in urban education policy from the University of Southern California, USC, a Master's of Education from UCLA, and a Bachelor's of Arts from University of California at Irvine. She's held various roles in equity, diversity, inclusion, leadership within higher ed, and has also helped with student success. And we are thrilled to have her here today. Welcome, Dr. Acuña.
Happy to be here.
So before we continue, Dr. Acuña, we always allow our guests to give a brief introduction about their background and themselves. Do you want to share a little bit more about your background and what led you to pursue a career within higher education?
Yeah, I think oftentimes, just like my colleagues, particularly in higher education, we don't often think about when we grow up, I want to be in higher education. We often fall into higher education in one way or the other, and it's usually shaped by our experiences. So I am a first-gen college student. I am an immigrant, and I'm really a lot of firsts in my family. But those identities really shaped my own experience as a college student, which is what would lead me to go into higher education. But yeah, I mean, loved my experience at UC Irvine, Zot. I love that place. I found some great mentors, really, truly amazing faculty mentors. Dr. Jeanette Castellanos being one of them, and Dr. Parham really took me under their wing. And also a lot of practitioners in student affairs and student life at UC Irvine. And I fell into several leadership roles as a student. So, for example, I, held multiple positions as doing leadership development for my peers, offering career advice, grad advice, resume development, workshops on leadership skills. And, by accident, really, I fell into research because I was already in these roles. And I just remembered one day being at the Social Science Academic Research Center, or SARC, at UC Irvine, which at the time was being led by Dr. Jeanette Castellanos, one of my mentors. And I just saw several students having very engaging conversations, and it looked like they were doing smart things. And I kind of became very curious, and I asked them, what are y'all doing? They're like, we're in the research lab with Dr. C, or we call her Dr. C. And so I was like, oh, that's really cool. So what do you do? And we get to do research. So we interview other people, and then we come up with these themes, and we write research papers, and sometimes we get published, and we go to these conferences. And I just didn't know that was an opportunity or possibility as a student. So I just remember I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Castellanos, and she instantly just said to me, okay, you're going to enroll in this class, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And then she just kind of laid a path for me, and I was a little lost at the time, but she was so reassuring in what I needed to do. She really just kind of walked me through it.
It sounds like you had a good mentor, for lack of, that really helped guide you, which, a lot of folks, sometimes it's putting yourself out there, getting that level of support. Would you say that it is critical for people to have someone like that in their life?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think I've held different types of mentors throughout my life. But I think, imposter syndrome is something that a lot of the people who are the first in whatever area that is, it can hit us, right? And it can really strike some fear in us as to whether or not we're capable and ready. And so sometimes mentors are people who see something in us that we don't see, because sometimes we don't know what the capabilities are. So it's not just a matter of like guiding us on how to do things, but it's like they see something in us. They see possibilities for us. So I think that really was important for me.
Yeah, and I will say my previous episode, I talked a lot about support systems with Saul. I was really blessed to have mentors and support groups that helped me along the way. And I know you work a lot with students. We'll talk about that later, but it is really important. I always advocate, and there's a famous saying, it's not what you know, but who you know. That's really going to get you there. I think that's really important as we're talking and really navigating life as the first gens or first in anything that we're doing in life. Dr. Acuña, I know you're, higher education. You mentioned that you fell into it, or it was something that, was kind of guided by whether it was getting involved in this club or research group. What was that what you wanted to be when you first got into Irvine, or were you just trying to get away from home? What exactly was it you navigating your childhood? I know you said you weren't born here. Did you have access to technology? And we'll jump into technology further, but I want to know more about your upbringing. Did you have the means to really navigate or understand it, being born in another country, Mexico, and coming to the United States?
Yeah, so I'll touch first on how those experiences led me into higher ed, and then I'll touch on the technology piece. But yes, so had great mentors, was exposed to different things that I never really imagined. And then at some point, one of my mentors, Dr. C, was like, well, as we were exploring career options, they're like, well, have you considered doing this for a living? And then it just dawned on me, oh, like you do this for a living and this is pretty cool. And I've benefited from this, so I could do this too. It really kind of it was like a light bulb in my head going off, because to your question around what did I want to do, I was not sure what I wanted to do. I came in majoring in international studies. I'm an immigrant, so I was like, well, I have all these, I have a perspective growing up in the border, and I want to learn about different cultures. So I knew I liked that. And I was bilingual, Spanish is my first language. I learned English. I just loved learning about different people from different countries. And then I love dance. So I was also a big dancer. So Irvine has a really amazing dance program. So that definitely helped.
Some people say I have 2 left feet, so I don't think that would have been for me.
No, but it's all right. Dance is for everyone. Doesn't matter if you have 2 left feet or 2 right feet. It's all good. But yeah, so that's kind of like when I was kind of already doing some of that work. And so I think the idea of continuing in that line of work, and something that was very embedded in me as I was mentored by all these folks, was the concept of giving back. And giving back and this concept of being an academic familia. And I remember my mentors saying to me, these are your siblings. These are your academic siblings, and you have to look out for one another. And so as a Latina, that concept, really, that was a concept that I was familiar with, right? Looking out for your family, looking out for your siblings. And so that's something that I could resonate with. And so I said, let's just continue to explore what it means to be a higher ed professional. And so that's how I went off to pursue my master's in student affairs at UCLA. And then, there's a whole other story into how I eventually, well, not quite eventually, because I finished my undergrad, did my master's, and right away started my PhD, which, was a bit of, had its own challenges in and of itself, being a first gen and having a lot of faculty members just not believe in my ability to pursue a doctorate. So I think all of that reinforced that this is the place where I needed to be, because academia was not a welcoming place for me. And in many ways, so many faculty told me, you're not going to be successful. You need to wait. You're too young. You're too this. You're too that. You're not enough of that. Like, I think really like the stubbornness kicked in a little bit.
Well, I think it's part of that, and also the doubt component, because being in a first gen, we do have some stubborn components of us, but I think it also impacts us in ways that it makes or creates obstacles and challenges. Some of us are able to succeed and thrive, but most often we have all these hurdles we have to overcome that, come day by day. And not to take away from what you were saying, but another thing that it's really important for our listeners out there, it sounds like you kind of started to find yourself at a later stage, meaning you got into this group, you were at Irvine, and that really helped you. So by all means, it kind of helps for anyone that's listening, that's really thinking about their career aspects. You are going to find what it is that you're passionate as you go. I talked about me and my upbringing and my trajectory, and it wasn't like something that I knew from the back. Like, it was technology is something I love, but it's really what we're exposed to. I think exposure is something I mention a lot. So, you basically overcame all these obstacles. You became Dr. Acuña, and all of this is, I always go back to like your childhood, right? You were born in Tijuana. And it sounds like, how was that experience? I'm just curious because, and the reason I'm curious is I was raised by my grandpa. My grandpa's from Mexico. I am of multi-race or multi-ethnicity. And, I was raised by a single parent. My mom is Mexican. So I would always go to Mexico, and my upbringing was, I didn't have access to a lot of things, but I did have access to go with my grandpa to the farm or to Zacatecas. And, I only saw what I saw. I never was around the big cities. Like, Tijuana to me was a developed city. In Mexico, it had more resources. What I saw was the farming landscape, right? A small town like Villanueva. Back then, it was like 20,000 residents, 30,000 residents, and it was small. But to me, it looked large. It's farming, a lot of harvesting. It's really hot. And you really don't see technology. My experience with technology, Dr. Acuña, was we used to have, like, I would go during every May, we would leave, and I wouldn't come back till August, September before classes started. And I like cartoons. So I used to watch in a black and white TV, one of those portable black and white box TVs, Dragon Ball Z. And it was Spanish. So I am also Spanglish, as we say it. I speak English and Spanish, but not proper like in Mexico. But that was my exposure. That was the technology that I got to see. We had like where we would go to the computer labs over there, the mini versions of it, but they were like really outdated machines. That's what I got to think about when I thought about technology at a foreign country like Mexico. What was your experience like?
Yeah. Well, I was born and raised in Tijuana, and then moved to Chula Vista like when I was around 9 years old. So I was a border baby. I grew up in the border, so I navigated two spaces that were very interesting. And the borders, can be a little bit different than the rest of Mexico because, of the fluidity that happens in that space. And it's changed over the years. But in terms of technology, I would say Tijuana is a place that's very vibrant. And it being in the border, you often have access to technologies that you may not have access to in more remote areas. My mom is from Sinaloa, from Badiraguato, and she's from El Rancho. And so where there were very scarce resources and food. And she tells me all these stories. But my mom, had been to Tijuana and had seen some of the possibilities, the education, the opportunities. And so that's kind of, and amongst other things, right? My mom, there was a lot of violence and other areas or things that my mom was trying to escape. But even that, right, is what drove my mom to the city of Tijuana. And so I think it started with my mom looking at these opportunities. And then, she had me, was raised in Tijuana. And, my dad worked in San Diego. So he would be bringing in dollars. And that was, we would live comfortably in Tijuana. We were not rich, but, when you make dollars, like you can live pretty well. And I remember we would go to the library, even in Tijuana, and we would, look at, there weren't a lot of computers, but it was the books. And then you would search the books with the index cards. And so I remember like doing that in Tijuana. And then there was El Secut. If anyone is from Tijuana or has visited Tijuana, it's a centro cultural or cultural center. And there's like musical performances. I know my mom would take me to the ballet and see all these live performances. My mom had never knew very little about it, but she loved the arts. So she would expose me to these, to the arts and also like media. So El Secut is like this huge round building, kind of like a movie theater, but it's like the screen is all around. And so it's this, when you're little and, especially back then with technology being so much more limited, it was so cool, right? Because it felt like they would do documentaries of the ocean and then you would like have to look up. And then when you looked up, there was like a fish like swimming on top of you. So I think it was like I was exposed to some of that technology.
So it sounds like you were exposed to technology at a young age. What would you say how old were you when you owned, quote unquote, your first technology device?
I was thinking about it this morning, and we owned a computer, I think when I was 9 years old, but it was a used computer. I'd have to ask my mom how we got access to that computer, but it was like, the old PC that you connect,
Yeah.
and I don't even think we had internet actually back then. We did not have internet. So we would use it to
Just type.
type and then play a game or two with the floppy disks. But we had no access to the internet. And it would break down all the time because it was, so old.
And the reason I wanted to bring up the keyword here, access, and I think, for me, my research is tied to the digital divide. For those of you that don't know what the digital divide refers to, it's basically the gap in access to, use of, and knowledge, whether it's information, technologies, communication. And that gap could manifest in various ways, such as lack of reliable internet or internet in general, limited access to devices, right? These could be any digital technical devices. And then to me, the most important one is digital literacy skills or skills overall, which is tied to information. Everything we have really gotten into is really talking about the digital divide. And for me, we just talked briefly about your experiences, and I mentioned briefly about Zacatecas and my upbringing, and also where I grew up here in Compton. And I won't say that a lot because I know in the other episode I mentioned it like 20 times. But with that being said and done, I know we went through a pandemic, which was COVID, and it really showcased or exacerbated what we went through when it came to the digital divide. As, people with not only people in Mexico, but really in the States, we saw a lot of these things that had to come up. What take do you have when it comes to the digital divide, Dr. Acuña?
What take do I have on the digital divide?
Do you think that we're now in a place where there is no longer a digital divide, would you say?
Yeah, no, most certainly not. And I see it sometimes with myself, honestly, and I see it with, my parents are aging. And then, being in higher education, working with college students, and with college students from from very diverse backgrounds, whether it's first gen, low income, but also generation and age. I think, that plays a big role. And it really, I would say, the pandemic really shifted the dynamics of the college experience for many students. And in some ways, I would say exacerbated the digital divide.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. The reason I wanted to keep it open and generic is because as I think about the digital divide, we're now dealing with the whole thing about artificial intelligence or Gen AI, robotics, and everything that's coming up. I still go back to we don't even cover the basics. And I mean the basics, your background's in higher ed. I've been working in higher ed. And one thing that I keep hearing and seeing is even during the pandemic, right? During COVID, it was really difficult for a lot of institutions to pivot and shift to to a digital landscape, meaning, leveraging LMS or, course-based, internet-based learning materials or methods. They had a difficult time really moving everything to the web. And that really showcased not only how institutions were ready to do that pivot. And I'm speaking higher ed now. I could only imagine what it was for K through 12. But when I was seeing that shift, I was like, okay, we, number one, have done a disservice to our students and to ourselves by not being prepared or ready to really move into this new way of working or doing or learning. And that, to me, I feel like we haven't tackled it yet. And I agree 100% with that lens that we should have learned better from that. However, I think there's a lot of dilemmas going on with whether we should move entirely to online learning or we should have a hybrid modality. Everyone has their own bias, their own perspectives, and their own beliefs. When it comes to even AI, a lot of faculty or a lot of folks that I know, they often don't believe that it should be leveraged, that, they should probably go back to their old ways of working or really learning, thinking about our own experiences. I was joking, and we were talking about this earlier about, how AI would have been when we were conducting research, how much easier it is for folks to leverage AI to help them with their dissertation. That's something that I missed out on, but I will say I did have the internet. I had Wikipedia where I was able to access resources. So whether we like it or not, technology is here and we do have to be able to use it. So going back to, the whole COVID, the pandemic, and whether we're even moving there, I just mentioned faculty not wanting to leverage or help their students leverage AI to really enhance or really get them to leverage it for their professional career. I think about, a lot of faculty or a lot of even professionals, a lot of schools, a lot of administrators, they themselves haven't gotten there with leveraging technology at its bare principle or the basics of it. What would you think that's fair to say, or do you have anything to add to that piece?
I mean, yeah, I would say even deeper than that. I generally don't see like this pushback against technology and even AI. I think it's a matter of like even universities being under-resourced to even access these technologies and be able to expose staff and faculty and, by default students. So oftentimes it's more like at the institutional level rather than individuals. And so that, again, adds to the exacerbation of the divide. For example, I worked at very large universities who, they tend to be very well resourced and, saw some great computer labs and tools for technology trainings for faculty and staff. For example, at the time when COVID happened, I was teaching. So I was in the middle of teaching a class. And then all of a sudden we were told that we needed to move completely remote on Zoom, 100%. So I was one of those folks who I get it. And I'm not a faculty member at this time, but I was again teaching a grad level course. And I feel for faculty because, and I'm young, I'm exposed. I think I'm decent with technology, but I struggled. I was struggling because I had designed a class to be fully in person. And I had to just do very basic level setting up a classroom online and then, making sure all my students were able to access Zoom. And then the classroom content kind of came after that. It fell after because that was kind of like, we needed to get them in that classroom setting first. So I feel for all instructors really during COVID. I know I experienced some challenges with that. So, but later down the road, I remember I had access to trainings. I had access to all these tools and I would get paid, and I was an adjunct faculty. I would get paid to do these trainings. Nowadays, adjunct faculty, who are probably the majority, faculty members and college campuses, they don't have access to this type of professional development. So we are doing a disservice to our students, because if they're not seeing their faculty members or instructors using technology or leveraging technology in a way that's going to enhance their learning experience, how are students supposed to do the same once they go on and graduate? So yeah, I would say it's a matter of resources too.
And it could be larger. It could be a systemic, really conversation that we could talk about. But I will share, my daughter being in a private school, her experiences, and I'm just trying to think about back what I got to see while I was navigating through that. Again, technologist, really big on the digital divide, making sure one of the things that I'm really passionate about is making sure that wherever I was, and I've worked in the public sector, is providing these resources or being an advocate or spokesperson for students, making sure they have all these means. But going back to my daughter, when COVID happened, it was like, boom, next day they were online, right? They were ready to go online. And to add to that, what I think helped the group out a lot, and my daughter in particularly, is having someone like myself there, right? I am a technologist. I was able to get her up and running, and she was already exposed to technology at a young age. So she had a really quick switch. It was hard for her to switch back to a traditional environment. But one thing that we advocated for a lot in that school is that they had this hybrid modality just to make sure that they were prepared for any future item. I would have hoped that to be the case for a lot of institutions where I've worked in or I've been exposed to. And unfortunately, I got to see the good and the bad of how they're preparing to really pivot and shift, because there's a lot of regulation, a lot of policy and all that behind that. However, and thinking about my nieces and nephews that were in the public system, they had a harder time. They didn't have, their parents were not as exposed to technology, that digital divide or whatnot. That was another thing. So I'm really thinking about the systemic component of it. And going back to higher ed, as I take a step back and hear everything that you said, bridging the access gap. That's one thing that we always talk about. And we always say, how do we provide access to technology and reliable internet, especially during COVID, right? There was a lot of programs out there to make sure that students of low income backgrounds, or all students, regardless of, had access to these means. You mentioned something that I think is really important, developing digital literacy programs. I believe that has to happen. You do have to implement comprehensive program to equip not only students, but everyone, faculty, administrators, with the necessary digital literacy skills to thrive in such an environment. And then, as they were pivoting, what I got to see in the online learning environment was, you have to address and make sure that what your content or what information you're putting online is going to be able to support, because you mentioned there's students of diverse backgrounds or different backgrounds, and you need to make sure that whatever you're posting or having out there is accessible and inclusive of all these students, because, some people consume information differently. When Audrey was going through that, I was able to help her consume and dissect that information so that she could understand. So I was also teaching her, helping the educators out there to make sure she was getting that additional support. And my family is really well versed with technology. Key component that you kept going back to was faculty. I remember that, and I still think, really supporting our faculty with effective online teaching, or really getting or demystifying those components. I say this because AI, and AI is the hot topic that's hitting everyone right now. And, everyone has some bias or some assumptions, and there's a lot going on, whether it should be regulated or not. When I think about that, is how do we provide faculty with the training and resources they need to effectively teach our students, right? And help our students, or all these diverse learners, is something that's really critical. So we talked about the digital divide. We talked about our, how your background and your experiences growing up. When I think about all of this, and, this podcast is about technology and life, when you bring it all in, and as you think about your background, your exposure, your experiences, do you think technology in of itself is a good thing that, is helping really tackle when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion, or tackling the initiative when it comes to the digital divide? What is your perspective on technology? And I mean technology in general. Everyone thinks that, technology is the end of all to some folks. There was just sharing with you, there was something that people were posting all over the internet that AI is coming to take people's jobs, right? And people see that as technology, a byproduct of technology. I see it as an opportunity, What is your stance on this?
Oof.
And it's a lot.
It is a lot, but I think the thing that comes to mind is, because we were just talking about the pandemic, is the role of social media, for example, and how it was one of the ways that it helped the world stay connected, for the better or worse, because, right, there was the social distancing created, I think, a lot of stressors in terms of that human connection. But it also connected us in ways that now we were exposed to some of the ugly in the world. And so, we think back about some of the movements that arose, towards the tail end of the pandemic. For example, when the Black Lives Matter movement rose or was more elevated after the incident with George Floyd, or a lot of the violence against Asian and Asian American population. It wasn't something new. Some of these biases and forms of all the isms were already happening in the world, but I think it just shed light. And because we were all still in our little silos, social media just put all this information into our devices or into our phones. And, I really do admire this new generation of young people, because they are really taking on this very difficult information and having conversations about what that means, right? What is the social reality in this world that we live in? And how are people of different backgrounds experiencing the world? And so I do see that they're a little more brave to talk about these things, which I don't think was the case even when I was a college student myself, and definitely not like my parents' generation. But at the same time, there's the cyberbullying that is happening, right? And a lot of people feel brave, but for the wrong reasons. And here's to say, people have their different opinions, but when, unfortunately, now it's come to the point where it's done disagreements are done in a way that are dehumanizing and putting people down. And that's kind of like the part that is just very challenging to see, especially as someone who, I do a lot of work in dialogue across difference in particular. And so folks are able to talk about these issues. I think folks are struggling to talk about it in a productive and constructive way. That is a challenge. And technology, I think, is definitely played a role in all of this.
I love that you went to that level of exposure, because you're 100% spot on. As I was thinking about this, when technology has exposed or shed a lot of light into what's going on across, not only here when it comes to, we're going through as citizens within the U.S., but also internationally. We're seeing everything, all the discrepancies that are happening there. Another thing that, is happening out there, disinformation or misinformation, right? There's a lot of that going on, with a lot of people just eating what they see in social media without really thinking, is it a fact, right? And I know that everyone's overwhelmed with what is a fact and isn't a fact, but a fact is a fact. And, I will say, a part of me, and this is just my perspective, I get upset when I see folks, and like my mom sends me things from Facebook, and I look at it and it's like this person spreading misinformation, and my mom's like, this is happening. I'm like, Mom, that's incorrect. Here you go. This is the article you should be reading. But it's like, I always have to fact check. I don't like doing it, but I have to, because it's my mom, number one. But I see that more and more, and I think about everyone, right? All that information that's out there. And how do all these folks out there that are consuming it, they're so overwhelmed. They don't know what's right from what's wrong. They don't know what to believe. I think it's done good, but it's also done bad, right? Technology has opened up a can of worms that most of us weren't ready for. And some people see it from a regulation perspective. Where do we regulate technology? Where do we regulate? I know a big one is AI, right? I talked about Gen AI, robotics. We could talk more about that. But a lot of people are like deregulate, quote unquote, all these different means. I think in a perfect world, regulation is important because it really helps, balance what's going on out there and your level of creativity. But you also don't want to go all crazy or evil, for lack of a better word. I don't want to be the next Terminator living through that if we don't regulate and make sure that everything is in there. There's a lot of folks that are scientists that disagree with that.
But to your point, like technology is created by humans, and humans inherently have biases. And so in many ways, we create technology based on our knowledge and experiences. Even if we don't mean to be, any harm, it's just that is the limitation of our knowledge and experiences.
I thank you. I actually like that you brought in that perspective because, me being a technologist and thinking about technology, I always have to be grounded by a diverse room that can really challenge how I think and what I think about, because I don't know it all. Unfortunately, there's a lot of folks that do think they know it all. And I think that's the biggest problem, that, we need to sit down and have a conversation, have dialogue. I know you mentioned this earlier, and really have that constructive way of engaging and talking about how do we create a better life tomorrow. And it's really complex. We're not going to solve it today, but there's just a lot that goes into like technology in of itself and, life in general as we're talking about this stuff. I will say something about myself that as you were talking, I do believe technology, for me, when I think about it, is how do I empower, and going into the higher ed perspective, I'm really passionate because of my background, and I think you are too. When we were talking about faculty, students, navigating all these collaboration, communication tools, I always bring in that student lens because that's what I had a lot of traumas navigating higher ed as a first gen. And I always think about empowering the students in anything and everything that I do, whether working K through 12 or working in higher ed, it's always really empowering our students to be critical thinkers. Or, even when I think about my daughter, to look at everything and challenge everything that she sees and to make sure that she's doing her own research, because it's already the can of worms is open. It's already out there, and it's going to be up to this generation to really do that level of work to make sure that they create a better tomorrow with everything happening today. Dr. Acuña, I know that we got into some deep stuff. Anything that, as we're looking ahead, anything that you would think, what are your hopes for the future? And this could be about technology, the digital divide, or education. Is there any final words you want to bring up to that?
Yeah, I think to the last points that you were making around technology and even the younger generations that are up and coming and are, digital natives. And that's what they were born into, is continuing to be critical thinkers. It's not just taking in any information the way it is and the way it's presented to us. But I think it's really like exposing folks to technology in a way that we encourage them to be critical consumers of that. And again, sometimes we think of technology, AI, of like this all something's in the cloud, a something, but remember, this was all human made. It was made by people with experiences, biases. It's imperfect just the way that, people are. And, we can go into a whole conversation around bias and AI as well. But it's just continue to be critical of technology. But technology, and I think I'm sounding a little negative, but like, I love technology. I could not go on a road trip without my phone. Even as a woman, going out at night. Sometimes, when I was single, a phone gave me a sense of safety too. Like, there's just so many benefits to technology and devices. But at the same time, we just have to be very, very, continue to be educated, continue to be critical consumers of it, so that we make sure that we use it in a way that's productive, in a way that is helpful for people. And
I love, I know we were
good for the world.
And I think I was, as you were doing these closing remarks, I was thinking about consumers, and for all of you out there, as we're talking about artificial intelligence, Gen AI or such, these models really learn behavior based on your input or usage, right? As you're contributing to it. So I really want you to think critically about that lens, because if we don't leverage it and or contribute to it, there is going to be a missing piece or component as they're developing these different models to build, you name it, anything that could be tied to any robotics piece out there. So I love that you mentioned it, or you brought that into this light, which is leveraging technology and being responsible consumers about it. When it comes to it, there's so much more that we could talk about, ethics and such. But for today, Dr. Acuña, I do want to thank you for sharing your insights and experiences. Your work is truly inspiring and vital for creating a more equitable educational landscape, and to me, the world overall. So with that, everyone, that is it for today's episode of Tech y Vida. Thank you to, again, our wonderful guest, Dr. Arely Acuña, for joining us today.